Something happened behind the scenes in Formula One that could force the FIA to rethink the rules. And it started with a piece of footage most fans were never supposed to see. Images showing Ferrari's SF-26 rear wing moving in a way no other car on the grid can replicate. A rear wing that does not just open. It rotates, almost flipping its aerodynamic profile when the car enters the straight. Engineers estimate this design could unlock between 8 and 10 km per hour of extra top speed in the right conditions. In modern Formula One, that kind of gain is massive. It means easier overtakes, stronger defense, and a completely different race strategy. But here is where the story becomes explosive. The moment this hidden footage started circulating inside the paddock, teams began asking the FIA a very uncomfortable question. Did Ferrari just find a loophole in the new active aerodynamics rules? Because if this system is fully legal, the SF-26 could suddenly become the most dangerous car on every long straight in Formula One. And the detail that triggered all of this is connected to something that happened during the Australian Grand Prix that almost nobody noticed. The Australian Grand Prix looked like a normal start to the season. New cars, new regulations, and a completely new competitive order beginning to appear. Most fans were focused on the obvious story. Lewis Hamilton driving his first race for Ferrari. But inside the garages, engineers were watching something very different. They were watching the data, speed traces, energy deployment, aerodynamic efficiency. Because the 2026 regulations changed one fundamental aspect of Formula One. Efficiency on the straights now matters more than ever. Less drag means more speed. More speed means more overtaking opportunities. And during the race in Melbourne, Ferrari looked extremely strong in several areas. The SF-26 launched well off the line. The car had excellent traction out of slower corners. Through medium speed sections it looked planted and balanced. Both Ferrari drivers appeared confident. Leclerc pushed aggressively. Hamilton looked calm and controlled in a car he had only recently started learning. For many fans watching the broadcast, Ferrari already looked like a real contender. But when engineers started analyzing the telemetry after the race, something interesting appeared. On the longest acceleration zones, Ferrari was fast. Very fast. But not the fastest. Another team still had a slight advantage in straight-line efficiency. Mercedes. Not by a huge margin. Nothing dramatic on television. But enough to appear consistently in the data. And in Formula One, a small difference repeated lap after lap becomes very important. A few extra kilometers per hour on every straight changes overtaking windows. It changes defensive strategy. It changes how teams deploy electrical energy across an entire race. Ferrari engineers understood this immediately after Australia. Their car had strong corner performance, strong traction, strong race pace. But on circuits with very long straights, they needed something more. More aerodynamic efficiency. Less drag, more top speed. And that realization triggered a decision inside Maranello that would soon capture the attention of the entire paddock. Because Ferrari already had a radical solution waiting. A concept they had quietly tested months earlier during the Bahrain tests. A rear wing so unusual that many engineers believed it would appear much later in the season. But after analyzing the data from Australia, Ferrari accelerated the plan. They prepared different versions of the system. And they decided to bring the Macarena rear wing to the Chinese Grand Prix. The moment that information started circulating through the paddock, engineers from rival teams began looking much more closely at Ferrari's car. Because if the footage from testing was accurate, this rear wing was doing something no other aerodynamic system on the grid was capable of doing. The first time engineers saw the full movement of Ferrari's rear wing, many of them thought it was a mistake. Not because the idea was impossible, but because the movement looked far more extreme than anyone expected. Footage captured during earlier testing sessions began circulating quietly between teams. Slow motion clips, high-resolution photos, engineers analyzing frame by frame. And what those images appeared to show was something very unusual. The rear wing of the SF-26 was not simply opening a slot like traditional systems. It was rotating. Dramatically. When the car entered straight-line mode, the main aerodynamic plane of the wing appeared to rotate through an enormous angle. Roughly 180 degrees. In some configurations, possibly approaching 270 degrees. That means the aerodynamic profile of the wing almost flips upside down. In corner mode, the wing behaves normally. It produces strong downforce. The rear of the car stays planted, stable, predictable. But the moment the driver exits a corner and accelerates onto a straight, everything changes. The system activates. The wing rotates. Airflow reorganizes across the rear of the car. And the most important effect appears immediately. Drag almost disappears. Engineers inside the paddock quickly started using two simple terms to describe the behavior: corner mode and flight mode. Because in straight-line configuration, the wing nearly produces lift instead of downforce, allowing the car to cut through the air far more efficiently. The result is exactly what Ferrari was chasing: speed. And a lot of it. Early technical estimates suggested the system could produce between 8 and 10 km per hour more top speed compared with more conservative active wings. In Formula 1, that difference is enormous. It can decide overtakes before drivers even reach the braking zone. It can allow a driver to attack without draining as much electrical energy. And it can make defending almost impossible for the car ahead. But the moment engineers from rival teams understood how extreme the rotation actually was, the conversation inside the paddock changed. Because the question was no longer simply about performance. It became a question about interpretation of the rules. The 2026 regulations allow active aerodynamics. Front wings and rear wings can change configuration between corner mode and straight mode. That part is clear. But Ferrari's design pushes that concept further than anyone expected. Much further. And that is where the hidden footage suddenly became very important. Because the images suggested that the rotation range of the wing might be significantly larger than most teams originally assumed. And whenever an innovation appears to stretch the limits of the regulations, something predictable happens in Formula 1. Teams begin asking the FIA questions. Technical questions. Requests for clarification. Not necessarily accusations. But careful investigations into whether the concept fully respects the intention of the rules. And that is exactly what started happening as the Chinese Grand Prix approached. Shanghai is one of the most revealing circuits on the calendar when it comes to aerodynamic efficiency. The lap begins with long sweeping corners that require stable downforce. But later comes one of the longest full throttle sections in Formula 1. The famous back straight. Drivers remain flat out for several seconds. And during those seconds, aerodynamic drag becomes the most important factor on the entire car. If Ferrari's Macarena wing truly enters flight mode on that straight, the SF-26 could suddenly gain several extra kilometers per hour compared with its rivals. That means later braking, more overtaking opportunities, and far greater pressure on the cars ahead. Which is exactly why the footage circulating inside the paddock triggered so many questions. Because if the system works exactly as Ferrari expects, the Chinese Grand Prix might not just reveal a clever upgrade. It might reveal the first major aerodynamic loophole of the 2026 season. And this is where the situation inside Formula 1 started becoming political. Because once rival engineers saw the footage and understood how aggressively Ferrari's wing could rotate, the focus of the discussion shifted. It was no longer just about speed. It became about interpretation of the rules. In Formula 1, innovation is expected. Every team searches for clever ways to exploit the regulations. But there is always a line between innovation and interpretation. And Ferrari's Macarena rear wing appeared to sit exactly on that line. The 2026 regulations introduced active aerodynamics for the first time in a much more flexible way. Front wings can change their profile. Rear wings can switch between corner mode and straight line mode. The goal was simple: improve efficiency, increase overtaking opportunities, reduce drag when the car is accelerating. But the rules never clearly imagined a rear wing rotating through such an extreme angle. And that is exactly why the hidden footage triggered so many internal conversations. Because when engineers analyzed the images frame by frame, they noticed something interesting. The rotation of the wing was not just large. It was dramatic enough to completely transform the aerodynamic behavior of the rear of the car. In corner mode, the wing produces strong downforce. But when it rotates into straight-line configuration, the aerodynamic profile almost flips, reducing drag to an incredible level. And that is where the concern began. Because if the drag reduction is truly as strong as the early estimates suggest, the SF-26 could suddenly gain between 8 and 10 km per hour more top speed on long straights. That kind of advantage changes everything. Overtaking becomes easier. Defending becomes easier. Energy deployment becomes more flexible. And race strategy begins to revolve around aerodynamic efficiency rather than raw power. Which is why teams started asking the FIA a very specific question. Did the regulations truly intend to allow a rear wing to rotate this far? Not because the system is clearly illegal, but because it may stretch the interpretation of the rules beyond what the designers expected. And that is where the Chinese Grand Prix suddenly became extremely important. Shanghai is one of the most revealing circuits on the entire calendar when it comes to aerodynamic efficiency. The track begins with long sweeping corners that require stability and downforce. But later in the lap comes the famous back straight. More than a kilometer of full throttle acceleration. drivers remain flat out for several seconds. And during those seconds, aerodynamic drag becomes the single most important factor on the entire car. If Ferrari's Macarena wing truly enters what engineers describe as flight mode on that straight, the SF-26 could suddenly appear dramatically faster than its rivals. That means later braking, more overtakes, and far greater pressure on the rest of the grid. Which is exactly why the FIA started receiving technical questions from several teams before the Chinese Grand Prix weekend. Not protests, not accusations, but requests for clarification. Because if Ferrari's interpretation of the rules is correct, other teams will eventually try to build similar systems. And if it is not, the FIA may need to define new limits for how active aerodynamic wings can behave. That is why the footage circulating inside the paddock caused such a strong reaction. Because sometimes in Formula 1, a single innovation does more than improve a car. Sometimes it forces the entire sport to decide where the rules truly end.